Making use of over-the-phone interpreters helps ensure that your organization is providing the best service possible to diverse communities. In this webinar, I'll share a variety of tips for optimizing your use of over-the-phone interpreters. Following these tips will help to improve your language access program, helping you to reduce customer effort, improving clear and effective communication, and increasing your likelihood of first call resolution. It will also help you to reduce average call handle times and provide equal access to your customers while improving situational outcomes. Finally, you can reduce risk associated with miscommunication and make the best use of staff resources. I'm going to begin by providing a brief overview of Pacific interpreters, review population trends within the multilingual community in the United States, discuss cultural barriers and awareness, discuss techniques for call takers, describe how to access an over-the-phone interpreter, and then we'll jump into the telephone interpreter tips. I'd like to provide you a brief overview of Pacific interpreters. Pacific Interpreters has been delivering multilingual support solutions to healthcare, business, and government accounts for nearly 20 years. In addition to our industry-leading telephone interpreting service, we also provide document translation support and language proficiency testing for bilingual or multilingual staff. Pacific Interpreters' corporate headquarters and primary call center is located in Portland, Oregon. We also have additional call center operations in Omaha, Nebraska, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, and Panama. We currently support more than 180 languages and dialects, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days per year, with access to more than 1,600 interpreters. Based on the recent 2010 U.S. Census figures, 1 of 5 people speak a language other than English at home. Out of the 60 million citizens, more than 42% have limited English proficiency, which is also referred to as LEP. In other words, out of approximately 300 million people, more than 25 million American citizens are limited English proficient. Certain states, like California, Arizona, Texas, and New York, have a higher percentage of non-English speaking population. We've also seen a heavy concentration of specific languages spoken in certain cities. For example, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area has a high concentration of Somali speakers. We've seen in Glendale, California, that Armenian has been a very popular language. As you can see by this chart, the minority population is growing exponentially. Based on the U.S. Census projections, the U.S. immigrant population will reach approximately 55 million by the year 2050. The Hispanic population alone, which today equates to about $1 trillion in buying power, is expected to triple by the year 2050. Over the next 40 years, the Asian population is projected to double. Why is this important to you, and who will your clients, patients, or members be in the next 10 years? How will you support your clients in this rapidly growing population? If you were born or raised in the United States, you might not be aware of some of the cultural barriers experienced by the limited English-speaking population. Factors to consider include fear of the government and police. In most cases, English-speaking citizens are accustomed to government agencies and law enforcement being a trusted resource. Keep in mind that this is not always the case in other countries and in other cultures. Fear of bringing shame to the family or clan and community is also a concern, and certain crisis situations may be viewed differently. For example, the lack of understanding that domestic violence is illegal and other basic laws that you may take for granted. Being self-conscious about their ability to communicate effectively in English may also add a sense of heightened anxiety when interacting with an English-speaking person. Dependence upon an abusive spouse who speaks English may also be a limitation for a non-English speaking client or member, or lack of familiarity with public services or civil rights. A limited English speaker may not be aware of access to health care and other mandated government services. In order to support minority populations, many organizations have implemented cultural competence training to ensure that they're able to market to, service, and support the diverse community. In addition, government and healthcare agencies have developed community awareness programs and campaigns for outreach to ensure that the community is aware of these programs and aware of what their civil rights are. Now, once it's determined that an interpreter is needed, there are 5 easy steps to accessing an over-the-phone interpreter and to ensure that the interpreting session goes smoothly. Step number 1, dial the interpreter. Call the phone number for your over-the-phone interpreting provider. Then, provide your client access code number. Be prepared to provide basic information to reference the call. This includes your name, your position, your department, and the caller's name. Step 2, brief the interpreter on the nature of the call. Explain what needs to be accomplished during the course of the call. Step 3, record the interpreter's identification number for future reference. Step 4, invite the interpreter to introduce himself or herself to the LEP caller. The interpreter may briefly explain his or her role and confidentiality obligations. Step 5, start the interpreting session. Now that we've outlined the steps for reaching an interpreter, let's discuss the tips for working with an interpreter once the interpreter is on the phone. In an effort to improve outcomes when experiencing cultural barriers, we suggest the following top 5 techniques for call takers. Number 1, conference the telephone interpreter in as quickly as possible. Whether the encounter is healthcare, business, or government related, a professional interpreter is trained to accurately and efficiently facilitate a transaction with your LEP caller. Number 2, use direct speech, which is also referred to as first person, at all times. Speak directly to the caller, not to the interpreter. I'll further review this method and the benefits of using this method in a subsequent slide. Number 3, retain control of the call. Keep in mind that the interpreter is an extension of your call center operations and is there to provide language support on behalf of your staff and on behalf of your customer and client. Number 4, when possible, avoid using children and other family members to interpret. In certain cases, it might be helpful to utilize a family member. However, a family member cannot replace a trained interpreter, especially in healthcare or public safety situations when an encounter requires a neutral or non-biased interpretation. Number 5, recognize and acknowledge cultural issues quickly and respectfully, and then resume regular protocols. Common courtesy like, "I hear what you're saying," or "I understand your concerns," can go a long way in bridging the cultural barrier. Now, in order to avoid hang-ups or dropped calls, when placing a limited English proficient caller on hold, we suggest that you prepare a document with phonetic ways to say, "Please hold," or "One moment please," in your most prevalent languages. This slide lists some of the phonetic ways to say either "please hold" or "one moment please" in some of the top languages that we see here at Pacific Interpreters. Also, consider recording a bilingual or a multilingual hold message, or even record background music or intermittent noise on your hold recording so the caller does not think that you've hung up on them. During the call, minimize background noise and the use of speakerphones. A speakerphone or extensive background noise can negatively impact the sound quality, and this would obviously impact the interpreter's ability to be accurate and complete. For call centers, also consider that the height and cubicle spacing and the distance between call center agents can have an impact on the background noise. A number of call center clients have also established basic call center rules of etiquette and best practices for conducive call taking within a call center environment. During the call, greet the interpreter, but then speak directly to your caller, not to the interpreter. Always provide to the interpreter the name of your organization and also relay any specific instructions for what needs to be accomplished or information that you're trying to obtain. Make sure that you note the interpreter's name and the interpreter's number for future reference. If you require a third-party caller dial-out, inform the customer service agent before bridging the interpreter on the call to ensure that additional call-outs can be made on your behalf. Now, as I mentioned previously, first-person interpreting is the most efficient and effective way to communicate with an interpreter and an LEP caller. In the past, second-person interpreting was a common practice. As an example, people would be calling or speaking to an interpreter and would say, "Mr. or Mrs. Interpreter, can you please say or do X, Y, or Z?" Needless to say, this is a fairly convoluted way to speak with the interpreter, and it adds extra time to the transaction as well. In a first-person interpreting scenario, you speak directly to the caller as if the interpreter wasn't there. Remember, you need to be brief, explicit, and basic in your requests. You also need to pause after a full thought so the interpreter's interpretation can be accurate and complete. If you speak too long, the interpreter might not remember or include everything you're saying. Obviously, they're trying to break down the sentence structure so they can relay the message effectively. Always speak clearly in a normal voice and not too fast or too loudly. Some people think that if they speak loudly or that if they speak slowly, that the LEP caller will miraculously understand English. Needless to say, this obviously is not the case. Here are a couple of things to avoid. Avoid long, complicated sentence structures. Also, do not change ideas in the middle of a sentence. Try to be as precise and succinct as you can during a telephone interpreting transaction. In addition, try to avoid asking multiple questions at once, which could cause confusion for the interpreter as well as the caller. Avoid any types of idioms, slang, technical words, or cultural references that might be difficult to translate or might not even exist in certain target languages. Also, keep in mind that jokes and humor can be a challenge for interpreting in different languages. Some concepts may be easy for the interpreter to understand, but extremely difficult to convey into the target language. Please keep in mind that all words do not translate in other languages. An interpreter may ask your permission to explain a word or concept in a target language. Always ask the interpreter to point out potential cultural misunderstandings. This practice will mitigate potential issues with the terminology used, and it will assist your efforts to secure the desired information in a timely fashion. In certain instances, an interpreter will ask you to rephrase your question if they feel that it might confuse the LEP caller or cause a misunderstanding. Again, the interpreter is there to help you out. Remember, everything that you say will be interpreted, so avoid private side conversations. Whatever the interpreter hears, they will interpret. That's part of their training. They learn to speak verbatim to repeat the message that you're relaying to them. If you feel that the interpreter has not interpreted everything, then ask the interpreter to do so. Avoid interrupting during the interpretation. Always allow the interpreter as much time as necessary to ask questions, request repeats, and/or request clarification. Also, be prepared to repeat yourself in different words or to rephrase your questions to ensure that the LEP caller understands your message. If a word or concept that you're explaining might be difficult to interpret, the interpreter may ask you to use word pictures for the LEP caller. This may require additional time to interpret your message. For example, if they're trying to explain the differences between an apartment complex and a housing tract, they might have to stop and pause and take a little longer to ensure that your message is delivered accurately and efficiently. Don't assume that the caller and the client understand you. In certain cultures, a person may say yes to continue the dialogue. They might not really understand what you're saying, but they might want to keep talking so they can follow the conversation and assume that they can pick up on certain pieces as the call continues. Also, and this is very important, remember that an inability to speak English does not indicate a lack of education. Don't ask an interpreter for their opinion during a transaction. The interpreter's job is purely to convey the meaning of the source language, and under no circumstances should they offer personal opinions. By the same token, don't hold the interpreter responsible if the caller doesn't answer questions specifically. It is not the interpreter's fault if the caller doesn't answer your question. Remember, in certain settings, an LEP caller might not be responding due to cultural, possibly emotional issues. In certain government transactions, it might even be a legal concern that might cause them to hesitate or to not respond. At the conclusion of the call, always close the call explicitly. If the caller disconnects, call back with an interpreter on the line as soon as possible. The interpreter will normally wait for you to initiate the closing of the call. When appropriate, the interpreter will offer further assistance and will be the last to disconnect. Okay, now I'd like to quickly recap the tips that we've discussed. and provide a couple of quick reminders on the do's and the don'ts when working with a telephonic interpreter. Do: brief the interpreter about what you want to share. Speak naturally and use succinct sentences. Always communicate in the first person, and verify that the caller is understanding the questions that are being asked. Don't use jargon, slang, technical terms, jokes, or anything that's not considered standard language. Don't use long, run-on sentences. Don't speak loudly or too quickly, and do not ask for the interpreter's opinion. I sincerely hope that these tips will help you out when working with telephonic interpreters. Thank you for your time, and if you have additional questions, please contact Pacific Interpreters by emailing us at info@pacificinterpreters.com or calling us at 800-324-8060. Thank you very much.